Most beginner developers find responsive layouts hard, and why not? It can be difficult knowing what content should stretch and how it should be done. What makes it even more difficult is the fact that you're first taught about pixels, widths, heights, and then you may have been told to leave them alone unless following certain rules. The next thing any developers may find difficult is JavaScript. It can seem daunting at first, because after dipping your toes in HTML and CSS, JavaScript can seem like well-constructed gibberish. And the real secret to improving in responsiveness or JavaScript is quite simple: build projects. A good project to build would be this time tracking dashboard. It will include a lot of responsive CSS that we have to use in order to make it look quite good between different viewports. We're going to have to use gridbar and flexbox, as well as using JavaScript to inject these 6 cards into our HTML. This project, you'll see me use the correct ways of handling responsive design, as well as using some simple JavaScript to load in the data from the JSON file. And I want you to look your best when you're approaching similar problems in the future, so pay close attention. Let's get started. You can find links, extensions, and more information in the description. Start by downloading all the files you need and storing them in your desired folder. Once that's done, just open up the design file in your Figma, if you have it, and quickly clean up the HTML. Attach your CSS files and quickly create them. And you might see font size 62.5% in my file. That simply means that one rem is 10 pixels and not one rem is 1 pixel. So create and link your JavaScript file. Keep in mind that you have to add the defer to your JavaScript file just so the code runs after the HTML loads. Whether you have the Figma file or just a set of images from Frontend Mentor, what you want to do now is just quickly analyze the design just to get a rough idea of how you might position stuff, what paddings and margins you might use, and whether maybe you're using Flexbox or Grid. At this stage I like setting my variables. So I'm going to start with the font family by importing it, setting the color and font size variables, and finally the Z index and border radius variables. Well, the first thing we want to focus on is this entire area, this entire section. So let's actually add a section that's going to be located within body, and let's add a class of activity tracker. The next section for us to focus on will be this particular menu item. So we just zoom into it, we can have a look. This will also be a section and we'll give it class of activity tracker menu. The next section I want to focus on inside of this section, instead of this menu, is this particular owner card. So let's just create a div and we're going to give it activity tracker owner, and we're going to give it an image with the correct location, the class of activity tracker owner image, and then have a div to contain this text report for and Jeremy Robson. So we're going to create a paragraph and a corresponding H1 to store them. The next section to focus on will be this daily, weekly, monthly. These are our options. So for that, let's create another div and let's call it activity tracker options. The first option will be a button with a class of activity tracker option. It will be given a data attribute, and data attributes can be accessed later on in JavaScript, and we can give it any name we want. In this case, let's give it the name of option and the value of daily. And finally, let's give the text of daily to the button, and let's create the 2 other buttons now. We can move on to creating the actual activity card. In this case, let's create a new section for it. We're going to give it the class of activity tracker activity. And to be able to select between the orange and the blue and the other colors, we will just give it a specific class, in this case a class of work, to correspond with what the actual class represents. And moving on from that, we want to focus on the background. So the entire orange bit is the background, and let's just create a div for it with an image of icon work as well. On that more of the information part of our card. So let's focus in on that, and in our HTML, let's create a div with the class of activity info. Then we can focus on more of what will be a header of the information. in this case, this part. Let's give it an actual header and give it a class of activity header. And then let's give it a h2 and a div to contain our menu button or options button. And finally, we can focus on this bottom part, which is all about the time frames and actual time data. So let's create another div called activity timeframes. Let's give it a h3 or with 32 hours of content and a class of activity current time frame. And of course a div to contain these three pieces of information. In this case, the time window that has last week, just a dash, and time of 36 hours. You can put this in a single paragraph. I just decided to split it up. And because we want to build the entire grid from the get-go, I'm just going to duplicate this code, and the only thing I'm going to change is the class from work to play. So if we focus on this particular code, you can see that the only things I've changed was the play keyword in this case. All the other information is the same. We just want to make sure that our classes work to select the correct colors, and of course that the grid itself will function as expected. And then we can paste in a bunch of other cards just so we can really make the entire grid work as expected. Now that we have our HTML in place and everything's actually loaded up, we can start styling everything. Let's start with styling our body, and let's just give it a basic width and min height, a background. Straight away it looks slightly better. And display grid allows us to place a child item perfectly in the center, both horizontally and vertically, as you can see now. And just because it's on mobile, we're going to have to add some padding as well. So now the content is properly laid out and it functions in either mobile or tablet or desktop. The next section we want to style is our section of activity tracker. So let's select that with our CSS, and let's give it a basic width and height, display of grid, and grid auto rows max content. This means that each row will actually be created by the browser, not us. So it will be an implicit grid, and each row will take as much height as it actually requires. And for now, because we're in mobile, we want a single column layout. And we want to justify the items to the center, and we just want to add a little gap between them that you can see if I just click on here. The next step is to actually start coding it for tablet. As you can see, our menu seems to be taking 2 rows. So for now, I've chosen 500 pixels to start us off. I'm going to select the same section. I'm going to use grid template columns, repeat, autofit, min max, 20 rem, 1 fr. What does this mean? Well, it means that our grid will now create columns as it needs and as it can automatically fit them in. Each column will be a minimum of 20 rem, and then it will expand until a new column of 20 rem or 200 pixels can be added. So let's see how this looks like. There you go. So they expand and shrink exactly as expected. So now both of these columns are 200 pixels. They expand until a new column of 200 pixels can be added. We can make sure that it has 2 rows. As we know, this will take 2 rows. Our menu. We're going to add a minimum height and a little gap as well. So now everything's looking slightly better. And for desktop, we know that in our styles, this will actually be 1110 pixels wide. Maybe you can see that down below. So that's what we want to add here. Just a maximum width. Everything else remains the same. Our next point of focus will be this section of activity tracker menu, as per below. If we start adding some boilerplate code after selecting it, we'll just add a background that we can see straight away. And we're just gonna add some boilerplate code here. Then when we reach tablet size, we want to be a bit more specific as to what we're doing with our menu. In this case, we're going to make sure that it's going to span across the two rows that we actually created previously. So we expand it now. You can see that it's spanning over two rows instead of one row like all the other sections are. And we want to create it as a display of flex, and we want it to be a column. Now we want to focus on the owner container. So let's just select the activity tracker owner, add some width and padding. It's also going to be a display of flex. We're going to actually set it to flex wrap, and I'll explain why in a moment. And let's just see how this styling is. Okay, it's looking pretty good already. And if you're carrying on, adding some border radius to the bottom, and in our media query, we just want to expand the padding. And now we want to strictly select this as a column as per our design, and add a flex auto. Then we can actually style the image. So if we just add a width, we can actually test one more piece of code, which is our flex wrap. We want it to wrap because let's say our display size is a bit too small. Our content will actually wrap now from this row into a new row instead of staying in the same one. And that's really the only use of flex wrap. It allows you to be a bit more responsive in your layouts. Moving on with the image, we're just gonna add the border radius and of course the border. And we're gonna make it slightly bigger on tablet size. Moving on to the owner container, we want to display a flex column, and later on in tablet we just want to set some boundaries. So let's just test how this looks like so far. So far so good. Owner 4, we just want to now we want to style this text. So let's just add some styling for both of these things and see how it looks like. That looks pretty good to me. And the owner name does change the line height later on after we reach tablet. And to finish off our menu card, we want to style our options. In this case, our 3 buttons, daily, weekly, monthly. Let's start it off by adding some padding to our options, and you'll see them in a moment when I add a little bit of color. I decided to space them out with flexbox, as you can see. And of course, later on when we reach tablet size, we actually want these options to be a column. So that's why we're defining column and just updating our gaps and paddings, just like that. Now, our tracker options, we want the width to be max content, as now our buttons will not take 100% width. Buttons are block elements, so they will take as much width as they actually can. So if you replace it with max content, this is fixed. And let's also add a color to these buttons for now. And there you go, you can see that. And later on, we want to transition the color, especially when you hover and when our button has a class of active, which will actually be added with JavaScript a bit later on. Let's just test that this works on hover for now. There you go. And this can actually be written in a slightly cleaner way. So let me just comment this out. And we can select activity tracker option again, but this time use the is syntax, is selector rather. So we can say when it is hover and when it is active. And as you can see, if I click back into here, it still works perfectly fine. And that concludes the menu card. The section we can focus on now is each individual activity card. So to start us off, we'll go and select it, give the basic things, and we want a very small grid here. As you can see that there's actually a very small overlap between these two containers. So we want the background to take up both, and for our text content to take up 1 of 4. We only have one column, overflow will be hidden, border radius, etc. When we reach tablet size, we want a slightly bigger top for the background, as we can see that in the design. It's ever so slightly bigger. Then moving on to selecting the particular card, we want to set a variable background as var red. And all these different variables will have their own background variable. So you can actually work with variables in this way. And then activity background will be grid row, grid column. Let's just select it. And the background is that var background. And as you can see, class of .work works, and then .play also works. And we can just carry on, display grid, and place items start end. So the start in this case is our horizontal, or rather it's our vertical, and our end is our horizontal for the particular image. And of course height will be 70 because of a small clipping issue I found later on. And we can just quickly translate the image just to get this positioning right. And finally, let's give it a Z index of bottom. Okay, and then we can actually focus on the information, which in this case is this container over here. Grid row, grid column. So now you can see that actually when it comes to the grid column, we're overlapping them, but the grid row is different. So this one is spanning all of them, and the information is not, because it starts a bit later on. So let's see how this works. That's perfect so far. We've given it a nice background now, and we're gonna give it a nice transition and a height, along with making it a flex column. Finally, we're gonna give it some gap pointer, and let's see how this looks like. So far so good. And when we hover over this, we want to select activity info, and we want to give it a different background. So when we hover over it, let's see, I click here and look at that. Okay, so as soon as I hover over the card, I'm selecting the child of activity info, the info container, and it's gonna give it a new background color. And moving on to tablet size, activity info just gets slightly different spacing with gap and padding. Then we can focus on activity header, which for us is right over here. Activity header and activity timeframes. They're both going to be display flex, wrap, and have this particular styling. And let's see what this does in our browser. So if I select it over here, let's just see. So everything's wrapping, everything's responsive, and you can see how nice it is to use flex wrap sometimes. It just helps us avoid some headaches that might occur on really small phone display sizes. And of course, for activity timeframes, we actually want it to be a column over here in tablet and desktop. Align items to the start, and voila, now we're a bit closer to following the original design, as now you can see that this is actually a column, but that was initially a row over here. And carrying on to just styling the activity name, we're just going to add some font styling. And when we hover over the options, we want to select the SVG and then the path in the SVG and fill it to white. And as you can see, it actually works. Yeah. And then we can move on to our time frame container. So just right here. So straight away we're just going to set a font size, font weight, color. There we go. And now this time frame is more or less styled. And overall, the previous time frame right over here will actually have to be a flex container, because if you remember, I added 3 paragraphs right over here. I've added 3 paragraphs and I just want them to work exactly as I intend, so I'm just going to keep it as a flex row. Setting the font size, and let's save that. And yeah, so let's see how this looks like. The cards are more or less styled now, and yeah, looking pretty good. If we quickly just expand the window, let's test it. This is the kind of grid I was hoping for initially, so I would say that this was a success. So now what we have to focus on is how do we inject these 6 cards with JavaScript. So I've commented out all our activities now, and it's time to add some JavaScript. So let's see what we have. so far I've added my data. I literally just copied and pasted the data from the JSON file given by Frontend Mentor. And here we have it. I'll show you how it works later on. So the first thing to do would be to grab these buttons. And if I right click on one of them, if I inspect on it, and then activity tracker option. Okay, all of these have the same class. So let's grab all of these by the class. So in this case, I'm grabbing const buttons, document query selector all, which allows us to use CSS selectors within JavaScript. And I'm grabbing all of them, right? So in this case, I'm grabbing all 3 buttons. Okay, we'll check that we have them in a moment. The next step would be to do something for each one of these buttons. Okay, so in this case, we're going to use the for each function or method. Buttons for each button. We're going to add an event listener. So button, add event listener of click. When we click on a button, something's going to happen. Okay. It's going to run a function called activate click button, and we're going to pass through the button that we're activating. It's going to grab this piece of information. So it's creating a variable first, clicked option, and then we're actually accessing the button dataset option. We'll see what that means in a moment. Then we want to run render cards with clicked option. Okay, so let's comment out these for now. And let's see what this grabs us, right? So if we just move it upwards, okay, I'm gonna do. Okay, so it's giving us daily, weekly, monthly. And if you recall, I've added the data option daily, weekly, monthly. For each button, I've added a data attribute with the name of option with different data. That's what we're grabbing here in this instance. And what that will allow us to do is when we render our cards, we're actually going to pass this variable and we're going to render the correct stuff. And why is it important? Well, if you look in our time frames, you'll see that time frames actually is an object that has 3 other objects, but each one of them has a name: daily, weekly, monthly. So we can actually grab the correct data thanks to this. We're listening to our buttons and we are calling upon 2 functions. The first function we are calling upon is activate click button. So let's actually add this function in. Activate click button is also taken in each button. So when we click on the button, we're actually passing through that button, the reference to it, through the function. So we can do it this way. And then the first thing we want to do actually is if any other button has the class of active, we want to remove it. And that's really easy to do for us in this case. We go through each button, and for each button we're going to access its class list and we're going to remove active. So if something has a class of active, it's now going to remove it. And then obviously we want to add to the button we're selecting, we want to add a class list of active. So we're going to write more or less the same code, just add instead of remove, and active. Okay, so let's save that and let's see if that works. If I click on a button, it should stay white, and it does. Render cards is not defined, and that's okay. We'll take care of that in a moment. But for now, we know that our JavaScript is working because these buttons are staying white. And if I right click on and then inspect, you can see that the class of active is actually present in the last button. So everything's working correctly. So now that we know our everything's working here, and we can run a render cards function once we click on a button, we can start adding some functionality to render cards, which ultimately will be the function that cards in our grid later on. But for now, let's just focus on grabbing all the data that we need. So we're gonna go and we're gonna loop through all the data initially. We're gonna go and call each particular object here as an activity, right? And the first thing we want to do is just grab the name of it. In this case, it's going to be activity.title. And if we quickly look at it, each object has .title, and we can just select the study, the work, and etc. So let's just minimize that. Okay, so that's one step that we can do. The next step would be to create a class for it. So some activities, especially the last one, actually have a space, self-care. We can't use spaces within CSS classes, but what we could do is add a dash instead of a space. So let's see how we might do that. We're going to grab the name, which is the title. We're going to turn it to lowercase first of all. And then we're going to replace something. We're going to replace the space in this case. So we're literally going to use quotation marks and space. And we're going to replace it with just a dash. And that should work. Then the next step is to grab the time frame data. So the time frames, we have 3 time frames. Depending on whether we click daily, weekly or monthly, we want to grab the correct object so we can get the current and the previous data. So let's see how we might do that. In this case, we go const timeframe data as a new variable. We're gonna select the activity, so we're grabbing the object. So working with like this entire object. And then we're going to timeframes. And now we have to use the string, the clicked option that we're passing through from our clicked button. If you recall, we're passing through this clicked option, right? That gives us daily or weekly or monthly. But it's a string, and we can't use the dot notation to access a property of an object or a value. But we can use square brackets. And this should work. And the last thing, and I'm going to show you that this has worked in a moment. And the last thing that we want to focus on is the previous time frame. So the previous time frame in this case is that if we clicked on daily, then the previous time frame has to say something like yesterday or last week or last month. And as you can see, our objects do not give us that information. We have to create it ourselves, which is okay because it's quite simple, frankly. So previous time frame, we're going to create a function called calculate time frame, and we're going to pass through the clicked option. So, daily, weekly, monthly. And let's see how the function might look like. We're going to create it within this function just because it's not going to be used anywhere else in our file. We're going to pass through the option in this case. And if our option is equal to daily and strictly equal, this is 3 equal signs, then we want to return yesterday. So we're just going to return a string, basically. Yeah. Otherwise, if it's weekly, return last week. And as you probably guessed, if it's monthly, return last month. Okay. And let's just see what's going on now. Let's just save that. I'm going to click on daily. And it's correctly console logging me the name. Okay. Let's check if our classes work. I'm going to click that again. Yes. So we can see that self-care has worked splendidly. Let me just zoom in on that. And then timeframe data, which should print us the object with all the information that we need. So we've got our daily, we've got our weekly, and we've got our monthly. So it's grabbing the object correctly with this. And remember that we're passing through a string here. And finally, we should see yesterday, last week, and last month. So yesterday, last week, and last month. It's printing them 6 times each. Perfect. Okay, so everything seems to be working on. And now what we want to focus is creating our elements. Now we want to create some elements in our HTML. And the decision we have to make here is how do we want to add the elements? I'm thinking that the best way to add them in this case is creating some elements within JavaScript and appending them, meaning adding to a parent element or to the end of a parent element in our HTML, and we'll see how we get there. The first thing is to create this actual section, because if you recall, we have each one of our activities is a section with a class of activity tracked activity and an actual class, which is taken from the name, if you recall. We've just done that. So let's see how that might look like. So const section, we're just going to call it section for now, because remember this is a for each loop. Const section document, create element, section. Okay, so you can assume that basically this kind of creates a section. It doesn't yet exist in HTML. We can add it later on. So for now we can store it within JavaScript, and you'll see how soon. And then section.classlist.add, so you've seen that before as well. We're going to add a class of activity tracker activity, and of course the activity class. So for example, work. And then we can create a string to inject. So So this will be appended to HTML, but inside of it, we can store a bunch of HTML. And in this case, I'm just gonna copy and paste it from my HTML, just like that. But to keep things dynamic, I've used backticks. And what backticks allow us to do is to use this $ curly brace syntax that then allows me to use variables within a string. So icon will, for example, turn into work or play, right? And then our name, instead of having it to be work, we can just use name, which will also be work, of course. And the last few things is time frame, so current hours. Instead of last week, we can use previous time frame, so whatever that might be. And of course, time frame data previous to get the previous time frame of hours. The next thing to do would be to add this entire string that we just created into our section. So let's do that quickly. It will be section, inner HTML, string to inject, because that's the variable name we've given this entire string. And this is the section, the variable we are adding the HTML to. And the last step would be to append this somewhere, but for now, let's just console log it. So if I do console.log section, let's just see what happens, right? I'm gonna click daily. Okay, so we have all the sections. You can see that we have work, play, study, exercise, social, self-care, and okay, you can see that they have a bunch of properties, etc., etc. And instead of console logging it now, let's try appending it somewhere. In order to append it somewhere, let's just remove this console log, and inside of our function render card, let's actually grab the main container. Whoops. Let's grab the main container that we want to append to activity tracker. This is the main grid. This is the grid that this is inside of, and it's the grid that we want to append all our elements to. So we're going to grab our activity tracker, and we want to do something now. So let's go down to the bottom here, and remember that we're still inside of our loop for each. So each one of these sections that we have created, we're going to append to the activity tracker. Let's see what happens when you click on daily now. Look at that. Okay, so far so good, but we're going to have a little problem in a second. If I click on weekly, you can see it's now adding more and more, and if I keep on spamming it, you can see that I'm adding all of them. The good news is that we are correctly grabbing everything. We correctly grabbed all our data, we are correctly using our inner HTML, we're correctly appending everything. So the problem to fix now, or the problem to solve now, is to kind of clear every time you run render cards, this function that creates all our cards, we actually need to clear the existing cards first. So let's do that. Let's create a function that will clear stuff. We're going to call it clear activities, and objective here, clear activities from our HTML. Okay, so first we have to grab them, right? Const activities, and we're going to use query selector all, just like we did with buttons. I'm going to select activity tracker activity as each one of these cards. Actually, if we inspect, and it should have a class of activity tracker activity. Each one of these is exact. Okay, let's go back to our console. So we've grabbed them successfully, and now what we have to do is just remove them from our HTML. So we can loop through them, activities for each activity, you can call this whatever you want, and .remove. That's literally all you have to do. It removes every single one of them from HTML. And the last thing we need to do is we need to grab this function and simply call it inside of our render cards. So let's save that. Let's click daily. Okay, let's click weekly and monthly. So now you can see the cards are not being added infinitely. We are clearing them, we're removing them from HTML, and everything seems to be working fine. And the next step could be quite simple. We could, let's say, because when we load this, we want one of these options to be selected, and there's many ways we could achieve this, but the simplest one is, let's say we want to click on weekly, the second option. Well, we can go to buttons, Buttons are an array. We know that the second item, where index 1, is the weekly one. And we can literally call upon click. And look at that. Every time we refresh, JavaScript clicks on this button for us. I hope that was somewhat helpful. I tried keeping everything as simple as I could, whilst remaining responsive and just trying to use decent practices. I could have refactored JavaScript, but quite frankly I thought that would be beyond the scope of this video. I just wanted to make this functional. So as long as it works on every display size and it doesn't produce any bugs, this could be a good way of achieving this result. I hope you've enjoyed this. If you have any suggestions for me, then just please leave them down in the bottom in the comments. Thank you.